Today, we become legends.
It's that time of the year again. A new Smite season has launched, and with it I need to update my comprehensive Conquest guide. This video will provide a full overview of Conquest, but if you want more in-depth information on the 5 roles of Conquest, be sure to subscribe to the channel as my comprehensive role guides will be coming out soon. As always, this video will be broken up into several sections to make it easier to follow. Feel free to skip around to the sections you need. First up, the very basics of Conquest. This section will cover what Conquest is, how to win, and a brief map overview. If you're familiar with Conquest to a basic level already, you can skip this section. Next up, we have the roles overview. This section covers all 5 Conquest roles, their aims, what they provide to the team, etc. After that, we'll take a look at the jungle layout and the camps within it, then the objectives of Conquest, what they are, why they're important, and the best ways to secure them for your team. Then game phases, aka early, mid and late game, plus what each role is meant to be doing in the various stages of a Conquest match. And finally, we'll close out the video with a few different smaller topics you should know about, but they aren't worth an entire bullet point in the video. So Conquest in Smite is the most complex game mode with the largest map, but at a basic level your only goal is to destroy the enemy towers, phoenixes and eventually their titan. The way you go about that goal is where the complexity of Conquest comes in, and don't worry, we'll talk about all that stuff in more detail in further sections. Conquest in Smite is a 3-lane map with 2 towers and a phoenix protecting each lane. You'll be fighting against the opposing people in your lane or in the jungle if you swing that way in order to get a lead. Take down the enemy towers and eventually destroy their titan in the base. Alright, so with the very basics covered, let's jump into the 5 roles of Conquest, a very important topic to know if you're new to the mode. Smite has been around a long time at this point, and the roles of Conquest have become very refined over that time. With 5 players on a team to work with, 1 goes to each lane, that's ADC, mid and solo, 1 goes to jungle, with the leftover player going support to help the ADC and make the duo lane. The solo laner in Smite resides in the solo lane. Their main job for the team is to be a tanky frontliner that soaks up hits, causes chaos for the enemy mid and ADC, and will usually be a warrior or guardian. Though solo lane is arguably one of the most diverse roles in terms of gods that can see play there, some assassins and even some mages or the odd hunter can occasionally work in solo. The solo laner generally spends the early parts of the match farming up and 1v1ing the enemy solo laner. As the game goes later on, solo laners tend to do big rotations with the farm lead they got in their lane to make a big impact in teamfights with their crowd control and damage. Moving across the map to the mid lane, the mid laner in Smite is usually an AoE burst damage dealer for the team that likes to blow up enemies in 2 hits before they can respond. Mid lane is pretty crucial due to its central location on the map and ability to get to pretty much anywhere from mid fairly quickly. Mid laners generally spend the early game farming minion waves and nearby jungle camps, with the occasional rotation to a side lane or for a jungle skirmish fight. You pretty much only see mages and the occasional hunter in mid, rarely anything else, and they're all about big burst damage while being very squishy themselves. So we've covered 2 of the lanes, who goes to the final one? Well, 2 people actually. The final lane is the duo lane, where both the ADC and the support spend the early game. The ADC in Conquest is the traditional hard carry playstyle. They're weak early on and squishy in general, but boy can they deal out some insane DPS once they get their build online. ADCs in Smite are usually hunters or a special class of mages called magical ADCs that use basic attacks for their damage. ADCs in the early game will lane with their support in a 2v2, then as the support leaves to do their rotations, the ADC will 1v1 for the rest of the laning phase against the other ADC to try and get a lead and snowball into their monstrous late game presence that most ADCs come with. The support is usually a tanky, high CC god that can protect the team, both for the ADC in the laning phase and the rest of your team when you start rotating. Supports will generally try and keep teammates alive so they can deal their big damage to enemies and ultimately win the game. Supports are usually guardians, but some warriors and assassins have been known to see play in support as well. As mentioned, supports spend the start of the game laning 2v2 with their ADC, but after 5 to 8 minutes the support starts rotating to other lanes and pretty much shows up where they're needed the most rather than covering one specific lane. So we've talked about all the lanes but only assigned 4 players. Who's left out? Well, that will be the jungler for the team. This role covers these 2 jungle areas between the lanes. While all other roles get most of their XP and gold from minions, the jungler will lurk in the jungle, taking the various jungle camps located there to keep even with the rest of the lane roles. Then they'll come out of the jungle to gank a lane where they can try and land a kill for their teammates in that lane to get them ahead. Junglers in Smite are fairly varied in terms of class, but are usually assassins, with a handful of warriors, mages and guardians that work, and very occasionally you might see a hunter pop into the jungle meta as well. Now you know the 5 roles of Conquest, try to always be filling one of these roles for your team to gain actual experience in a real Conquest match, not just arena on a bigger map. My personal suggestion is to learn 2 roles pretty well, since the role queue system in Smite allows you to select a primary role and then a secondary role. So we talked about the jungler. I think it's high time we covered the actual jungle's layout. What camps are located there, which ones are important to you, as well as the jungle objectives of Conquest like the Fire Giant. So I find it easiest to look at the Conquest jungle as 3 sections. Your jungle, the enemy jungle, and the neutral jungle in between. Your jungle and the enemy's jungle are just mirrors of each other to keep the game fair, so all you really have to do is learn one side of the jungle plus the neutral camps and you're good to go. To figure out where an enemy camp is, you just look at your own jungle and flip it. So I like to split the actual camps of the jungle into 3 categories as well: harpies, buffs, and special camps. Harpies are simply camps that give XP and gold when killed and nothing else. These are purely to keep the jungler even in farm and sometimes for laners to get a little bit of extra XP between their minion waves. But as a laner, don't ever give up your wave just to get a harpy camp, the wave is more important. The buffs are slightly bigger camps that still give XP and gold but also drop a powerful buff that lasts 2 minutes on death. Purple buff gives attack speed and a protection shred aura and is picked up by the ADC. The green buff gives increased max health and mana and goes to the support. Red buff gives increased power and goes to the mid. Speed buff gives increased movement speed and goes to the jungler to help them get around faster. And finally, the blue buff gives mana regen and cooldown reduction and goes to the solo laner. So harpies and buffs covers most of the jungle camps, but not all. There are a few camps in the game that don't really fall into either category, but have unique and powerful effects. Firstly, there are the Naga camps on both duo lane and solo lane. Duo have 1 per team, but solo has to fight over just 1 of them between 2. The Greater Scorpion on solo side will give XP and gold, as well as enhancing the next round of buffs dropped by your team to give them better stats than the normal buffs. The Totem of Ku is just off the side of solo lane and provides mana regeneration to the whole team when killed. This is taken pretty much exclusively by the solo laner between waves. And finally we have the Oracle Harpies. These are tougher than normal Harpy camps, but give an area of vision around the Gold Fury that cannot be countered. Useful for keeping tabs on if the enemy are trying to sneak the Gold Fury out from under you. On the topic of Gold Fury, now we've covered the jungle layout, let's talk about the objectives of Conquest, one of the most important yet tragically overlooked aspects of the game. In Season 9, a new objective was added to the Conquest map in the form of the Obelisk. These obelisks are banks of power that fill up over time from taking jungle camps with this mark on them. The first team to get 7 of these offerings into their obelisk gains a powerful jungle buff effect called Indra's Scepter that either provides health regeneration if you're alone, and if enemies are around you, it fires lightning bolts at them once per second which deal significant damage. Enemies can steal offerings from your obelisk by standing next to it, taking 10% current health and damage per offering they steal this way, and of course you could do the same to the enemy's obelisk. It's basically a rush to 7 offerings as soon as the obelisks become active in order to get that big boy jungle buff. But moving on to the more traditional objectives of Conquest, we have the Fire Giant, Gold Fury, and Pyromancer. We'll start with the Pyromancer since it's the simplest of the 3. Pyromancer is a boss objective that, like all bosses, usually requires multiple team members to take down, but provides a powerful reward. In this case, it's a large movement speed buff when leaving the fountain to get back to lane or fight quickly, as well as gold and XP for every player on the team. The Gold Fury in Smite is located over by duo lane and has 3 different variations. Again, it will usually take multiple people to kill a Gold Fury, and it gives great rewards that change depending on the type of Fury that's there. The standard Gold Fury just gives a large amount of XP and gold to the entire team when killed. The Oni Fury gives less gold and XP to the whole team, but empowers your next minion wave in each lane to be tankier and deal more damage, making it easier to push on the enemy. And finally, the Primal Fury gives a permanent buff to all team members that increases the damage they deal to jungle camps and objectives, and this buff stacks with multiple Primal Fury kills. The Primal Fury still gives gold and XP, but again at a lesser rate compared to a standard Gold Fury. So as you can see, the benefit is quite different depending on the Fury that is currently spawned in, so you do have to be paying attention to that. The first Fury of the match will always be a standard Gold Fury, and after that is completely random which Gold Fury it selects, without doing the same one twice in a row. And finally, we have the big boy of Conquest, the Fire Giant. This guy is the most powerful objective on the map, both in terms of how strong he is and how strong the buff is for killing him. Fire Giant should almost always be taken as a team, even more so than the previous 2 objectives, as it has a ton of HP and damage. His buff lasts 4 minutes and gives bonus power, health and mana regeneration, as well as bonus damage to structures to help you end the game if you do manage to slay the Fire Giant. At 30 minutes into the game, the FG is replaced with the Enhanced Fire Giant, which gives the same buff but a lot better. So a typical Conquest match can be divided into 3 key time periods: early game, mid game, and late game. While there's no set time of the match that you come out of the early game and into the mid game, all 3 phases have their own distinct feel and ways to play in them that you pick up over time when you've played enough of the mode. You basically get a feel for it. The early game, in my experience, is generally the first 8 to 10 minutes of the match or so. In the early game, most players are farming minions and or jungle camps to get XP and gold. Any fights that go down in the early game are usually skirmish fights between lane opponents or small 2v2 or 3v3 fights over buffs and ganks. Or just if players want to gain a lead by fighting in the early game, that's an absolutely valid strategy. Proper farming is the most crucial thing to master for the early game, even more so than your fighting skills. Since the early game is all about farming, doing it slightly better than your opponent can make up for a substantial skill diff in the fighting department, since you'll be a couple levels up on them at all times. Farming in general is a technique that players don't learn in other modes because it's not really needed in the same way it is in Conquest, so keep that in mind if you're transitioning from another mode to Conquest. The mid game is generally between 10 and 20 minutes into the match and is where teamfights start to happen and objectives come into play in a major way. The laning process starts to dissolve in the mid game as mids, solos, and ADCs start to join the fights a lot more, while supports and junglers were already roaming a lot even in the early game. Laning isn't entirely done in the mid game, but it basically wraps up throughout the course of the mid game to where by the end of it you really shouldn't be laning anymore and should be focusing on big team fights and objective plays. Gold Fury is a key focal point of the mid game since most teams aren't yet strong enough to take Fire Giant but are strong enough to take Gold Fury, which still gives game changing rewards. So always try to keep objectives warded, but especially in the mid game pay attention to the Gold Fury. The late game is generally 20 minutes plus and is when full scale 5v5 teamfights are commonplace and Fire Giant becomes the central focus of both teams. Laning at this point is definitely done and you should be grouping up with your team to fight as a unit regardless of your role. In late game teamfights, the general job of each role is as follows. Supports will stay back to keep alive their backliners, which is the mid and ADC, and allow them to do their damage without fear of dying, while the solo laners and the junglers are diving the mid and ADC to try and kill them, which is being protected by the support. That's basically a very high level overview of teamfight structure in Conquest for late game. Alright, so with game phases covered, let's get into some final small topics that didn't deserve their own section but did deserve to be in the guide. So I've already touched on warding when talking about objectives, and I know buy wards is something that's drilled into you from the minute you boot up this game, but wards truly are crucial to improving your gameplay. You can only make the correct decision if you have the information to come to that correct decision, and wards provide you that information for a measly 50 gold. They're absolutely worth it. Here's a few good ward spots for objectives and for various roles. You can pause the video if you want to get a better look at some of these. So invading in Smite is far less common now than it used to be, but it does still happen and so I think it's worth talking about. Invading is the process of stealing enemy camps for yourself. This is by nature pretty risky as you're venturing deep into enemy territory to secure these, but the reward is effectively a camp that's worth double a normal camp, since you gain a camp and the enemy loses a camp. If you're completely new to Conquest, I wouldn't recommend invading too much since it can absolutely get you killed when done poorly. But when done right, it can be a great way to get ahead and starve your opponents of XP, gold, and jungle buffs. Rotations in Smite are probably the most elusive and hard to define skill since every single rotation you ever make will be slightly different. At least with wards, I can say place your wards here, here, and here and you'll probably be fine, but with rotations, it's very hard to pinpoint when you should rotate and when you shouldn't. It's the reason I've delayed a rotations guide so long despite getting a lot of requests, but if there's interest in a more in-depth rotations guide, I'd be happy to make one. Whenever I consider a rotation, I do a quick check with myself to ask what I'll be losing for rotating and what I could potentially gain from the rotation, as well as how successful I will be most likely. If I miss a minion wave just to rotate to mid and then take the mid camps and come back to lane, that's not worth it. A wave is worth more than a mid camp, but if you rotate, lose a wave, and gain a gold fury, that rotation was worth it since it's much more valuable than a single minion wave. It's all about the opportunity cost of what you could have gained versus what you'll lose. Moving on to ganks, so ganking in Smite is the process of coming out of the jungle into a lane to attack an enemy lane opponent and help your teammate in that lane. Ganking is done the most by the jungler as it's one of their key jobs, but ganks can and should be done by all roles. As with rotations, you have to balance ganking with farming and make sure you don't lose too much for going for a gank. And finally, communication is key in Conquest. Whether it's a simple VGS command to tell your teammates that your lane opponent is missing, or a full-on Discord call with all 4 of your teammates, however you do it, communication will always improve your gameplay, since you can act as a unit instead of 5 people all doing their own thing and dying one by one. With good communication, you can make clear calls to go in on fights or to do objectives. Don't be that guy who ignores every call made just to split push his lane. No one likes that guy. But that's it for the complete Conquest guide for Season 9. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you did, then why not subscribe to the channel? I make guides like this all the time for Smite, and you can catch new ones as they release to get the edge. Don't forget to drop a like on the video before you leave, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.